Bonjour, and welcome back to episode 11 of my French Revolution vlog. And this time we're going to be considering the Directory, or the first couple of years of the Directory. And this is the last topic of our French Revolution unit. And it really considers that gap between the ending of the Terror and the execution of Maximilien Robespierre after the coup of Thermidor in July 1794, and the coup of Brumaire, which brings Napoleon to power in 1799. And it's seen as a period probably of less dramatic events. But the big two questions that we have to face are in what ways and how far was the Directory successful? Does it actually address those problems that have been, in some cases, lying around France for the last decade or so? And perhaps longer in some cases. So how successful is it? And then also, why does it fail? In 1799, why is there a coup to overthrow it? So let's start with a little bit of context for this. The big issues that faced the Directory as they took power in 1795. So the coup of Thermidor was in July 1794, and that overthrew the previous regime of Robespierre, the committee, the CPS, the Committee of Public Safety. But of course, it didn't bring in something new. So they have this gap where they're working out a new constitution. That comes into place in August 1795. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But in that lull, almost a year, several things become apparent that are issues the Directory is going to have to deal with. So apart from who's going to run the country and how's that going to work, the economy becomes a big issue. Control of the country and political violence becomes a growing issue. And the war and ending the war is something of an issue, but in particular connected with that, the threat of emigres from abroad wanting to bring back a royalist government within France. So let's kind of work through those things in some sort of chronological order. And if we start off with actually the war, the war was actually going quite well. So you remember that the terror had been brought in partly because of problems sorting out the war early on, and that the threat to Paris that they were facing. By the end of the terror, in fact, this is one of the points that the indulgence made, was that the war had actually turned out much better. And in 1794, the French turned the tables on the Austrians in the north, and they conquered and occupied the Austrian Netherlands, kind of what we'd call Belgium today, and then pushed back the Dutch Republic and the English, and effected an uprising, in fact, in the Dutch Republic, which led to the creation of a pro-French, what's called the Batavian Republic in what we would call the Netherlands today. The actual Netherlands, not the Austrian Netherlands. So in the north, that war had already kind of gone well, and that's brilliant for France because it creates some stability and also brings in some cash, which they're able to levy off those occupied countries. However, the sort of threat from abroad continued to rumble on. In June 1795, the son of Louis XVI, who had been kept in prison in Paris, was very sick and died, probably partly as a result of the conditions he'd been kept in, but certainly not directly as a result of being beaten or tortured or anything like that. That meant that technically he had been king in the minds of royalists, and so when he died, the Louis XVI's brother was next in line to the throne. He announced he was the Comte de Provence before this, and he announced himself to be Louis XVIII, and issued on the 24th of June 1795 what's called the Verona Declaration, Verona being the place where he was staying. And he announced in that declaration that he was king and that he was going to come back to France, and essentially that he was going to wind the clock back to 1789. He was going to bring back the Ancien regime and the estate system and everything that was good about France before those dirty scoundrels, the Republicans and their sans-culottes, got hold of France. Now, the problem with that actually is that the threat of that, let's start with that first. The threat of that is there is quite a well-established emigre presence abroad, both in northern Italy and also in the Rhine area of what we would think of as Germany, around Koblenz, as two kind of small but perhaps quite well-equipped armies there. So that's an issue, and there's a threat based there. And the weakness of this, of course, is that the Comte de Provence, or Louis XVIII, as he likes to call himself, didn't really understand that actually, at a basic level, the revolution had been um, popular, and that people didn't want to go back. Maybe didn't like what was happening in France at this time, but they didn't want to go back to the estate system and all the abuses and inconsistencies of the Ancien regime. So, in terms of threat level, that's not too bad. And even in 1795, when they attempt to uh, um, invade, for want of a better word, this is shown to be quite sort of shambolic, really. And there's a landing, in fact, in June 1795 at Quiberon Bay in Brittany. Quiberon is, or Quiberon, maybe, Quiberon, is defeated after about a month of some fighting. And this is an alliance really between Bretons, the part of the Chouannery rising that's going on there, and royalists who had landed, emigres that had landed. This was a really big blow to royalists, though. It was defeated fairly easily after only a month of fighting. And an attempted invasion in September, led by the Comte d'Artois, um, Louis XVI's youngest brother. There are three brothers. Comte de Provence, Louis XVIII is the middle brother. Comte d'Artois is the younger brother. That was an attempted invasion, landing on the Isle of Yew in the Vendée. But it really, although there was violence in the Vendée at the time and some uprisings, it lacked coordinated support, and again was quite easily put down. So I'd say that the context here is actually that the emigre threat is real, but only moderate in terms of its and how large it is, how well organised it is, and crucially, how well supported it is. Political violence, however, linked to that, was an ongoing sporadic issue that the Directory was going to have to face when they got into power properly. So straight away, or almost straight away after the Thermodoran Revolution, there's what begins to be known as the White Terror. This starts in the autumn of 1794, runs through to the late spring, early summer of 1795. And this is a sort of revenge terror, a shadow terror, if you like, from the real one, the grand one, the great terror of Robespierre. About 2,000 people die in it, so far fewer people die in the White Terror than the Jacobin Terror. That's what we should call it, I suppose. And rather than being organised by the government, the White Terror is mostly vigilante violence. And of course, it's targeted against the Jacobins in complete reverse of the Jacobin Terror. And this time, as I said, rather than the government organising it, the government just kind of turns a blind eye to the White Terror. And actually, the other sort of big difference, I guess, is that the White Terror really is about trying to end the revolution, or at least stop the revolution where it was. But the Jacobin Terror had been about pushing the revolution on to its ever more radical end. That said, there are some big similarities between the White Terror and the Jacobin Terror. They're both encouraged by journalists. They're both centred in the same sort of places in Paris. It spreads out to the provinces. In both areas, it's the same sort of areas that are affected, Marseille, Lyon. And they both see killings on a mass scale. So obviously the Jacobin Terror is more mass, but the White Terror, nonetheless, 2,000 people being killed, is not insignificant. And the violence kind of continues with a couple of risings in 1795, the risings of Germinal and Prairial. These are risings of thousands of people in Paris. They march to the convention, kind of like the sans-culottes of the old days. But in both cases, so 10,000 people march to the convention in the Germinal rising of April 1795, and in fact, I don't know how many more people probably, and the Prairial uprising. It seems like there will be more people, but we don't know the figures for it. Sans-culottes, and this time joined by National Guard members, disgruntled National Guard members, and the following month, about 6 weeks after that, in the rising of Prairial. However, in both cases, those uprisings are dismissed fairly peacefully. There are 20,000 troops are used in the Prairial uprising, which is why it seems like probably more than 10,000 people there. And they're sent home. 6,000 people are arrested, but there aren't sort of recordings of mass violence, and certainly not that the sans-culottes in either case is able to bully the convention into doing what they want. In the rising of Prairial, the convention do agree to set up a food commission, but that's it, and nothing else is done as a result. So this sort of political violence that's happening is on a lower scale than it had been before. It really reaches its peak in October 1795 with the Vendémiaire Uprising. This is a rising of about 25,000, mostly royalist supporting Parisians who try again to overthrow the government. And this is a proper attempt, the last proper attempt, I would say, of a popular uprising aimed at overthrowing the government of the revolution. And this is where Napoleon, one of the places where Napoleon makes his name, by he's brought in to physically, violently put down this revolution or the revolutionary attempt, the Vendémiaire Uprising. And famously, he brings his cannons into the streets and fires grape shot at the protesters. Grape shot being not one cannonball, but a bunch of smaller cannonballs to spray out at the crowd. And it works. The Vendémiaire Uprising is crushed decisively, and the military here help the Directory to maintain power. So, in terms of uprisings, the Directory in the first sort of year and a half of the Directory period, there have been issues and there has been a threat, but they've been overcome pretty successfully. Um, the one area that we're just going to think about before we finish is the economy. The economy is actually an area of weakness. But if you think about it, the economy has been an area of weakness really since before the revolution began back in 1789. It does, however, get worse during this period. The Thermidorian government ended price controls in December 1794. These have been trying to keep a cap on prices for, I think, probably for ideological reasons. They got rid of those. Thinking, I guess, that the laws of supply and demand would bring prices down and help people out. But a bad winter of 1794 and 95 meant that inflation pushed prices up. And the government had to still keep supplying the army. So it actually ended up printing more money to supply the army, to buy things for them. And that made the inflation worse. So that by May 1795, the assignats, the currency they were using, had lost 96% of its value, and 20% of Paris at that time was surviving on food relief, bread rations that were being handed out to them. So this was a complete kind of economic meltdown that the Directory were going to have to face. And when the Directory was established in August 1795, that was, I would say, the single biggest issue that they faced. So political violence was a problem, but it was being dealt with on each occasion that it arose, and it peaked, I would say, in the late 1795. The foreign threat was, I think, under control, although it hadn't gone away completely. The issue of who ran the country was established, although as we'll see next time, not perfectly, through the Directory itself. But the economy was in free fall and was a big issue that they were going to have to face. I hope that's helpful. Next time, we'll talk about the Directory itself and the political situation there, and we'll consider their policies in the following couple of years. See you then.